Hi folks, in this video we'll be taking a look at some simple techniques for using a bowsaw and an axle billhook in small scale coppicing scenarios. So what this video won't be is a detailed description of how to fell large trees with something like a chainsaw. That's quite a dangerous activity. It requires some specialist knowledge, and really you should undertake a course. We're really going to be dealing with small diameter woods, typically on short rotation coppice, things like willow, hazel, possibly sweet chestnut. So one of the first things I think is worth thinking about when you're dealing with wood, there's always going to be some level of tension in that wood, and the tension will either be actually tension or compression. So both those two forces are at play and will impact on how you fell and impact on the tool you're using. So if you imagine this was a tree, and the tree could be leaning, it could be blowing in the wind, there's all sorts of pressures that are applied to such a slender stem that reaches quite high into the air. But it also applies if that stem was lying horizontal, so once you felled it, similar tensions also exist. So if it's upright and it's bending or leaning, you can see that there's going to be different tensions and pressures in that stem. Now if it's bending this way, this side is actually stretching and that side's compressing. So on this side you'll have compression and that side you'll have tension. Now the same thing will also happen if this is lying on the ground or nearly horizontal. If the top is free, this will still be wanting to bend down with tension, and this side will be compressing. So any compression will pinch your blade, and you need to be aware of that when you actually start the felling process. Now if this stem had already fallen and was being held up on a rock or another stump, it would be bending that way. So now the compression will be there and the tension will be there. So it's just worth having a think about that whenever you're dealing with poles or tree stems, and think about where the tension and compression is in relation to where you're going to be working. So the two sets of tools they'll be taking a look at today is the simple bowsaw, and then also a tool for snedding or limbing, and in this case a light hatchet or potentially a billhook. So if we start with the saw, now this is a 21-inch, fairly standard saw for one-handed operation. For this small scale coppicing we'll be looking at, this is probably the saw you'll be using. So the first point to note is that there are different teeth patterns on saw blades. So this one is a simple peg toothed blade, but you also get peg and raker blades. So this one, you can see there's the 4 pegs and then you have rakers in between. Now what these do, this is more typically for use in wet or green wood. So the pegs do the cutting and the rakers clear out the chips from the cut, and that helps you to process through wet wood much more easily without the blade catching or getting pinched. Now this is the one I've been using recently in the coppice, and it doesn't have the rakers on it, but it actually has worked fine. Now when you're cutting in winter, there's a lot less sap in the tree trunk, and it's not as much of a problem. But if you do find you're having an issue with binding, then it's worth considering getting a blade with the rakers on it. Something you can consider when you're actually going to start doing the felling is if you want to try and leave a very clean cut on the stump, because this is not a felling cut to kill the tree, it's actually a living entity. You're going to leave a stump and the root system, which is going to flush through to the next year. So you want to keep that stump very clean. So in order to do that, you might find that if you damage the stem at all during your felling, it's sometimes easier to start higher up, and then you can always clean off the stump later when there's less tension and pressure and you don't have to deal with the stem. You've just got the stump left and you can cut it off lower nice and cleanly. So if we take a look at this small diameter willow tree, you can see that is a bend leaning this way. Then as it gets a bit higher, you can see that it's leaning another way. Now lean can occur for a number of reasons. It can be reaching for sunlight, it can be on a slope due to gravity, or it can be due to wind pressure. So in this case, on this section, this portion here will be under tension and this will be under compression. But then as you go up to the next stage, it actually moves around and the compression will be on this side and the tension will be on this side. So as a rule of thumb, I like to think about it in 3 stages, 3 different types of cuts based on 3 different sizes. So 1, 2, 3 are the 3 different types of cuts. They're going up in complexity. And if you think the size range of 2-inch, 4-inch, 6-inch, which equates to about 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, and 15 centimeters. So the first cut would be anything under 2 inches or under 5 centimeters, and that is 1 cut. The second group would be anything under 4-inch or anything under 10 centimeters, and that would be a 2-step cut. And then the third one would be a 3-step cut on tree trunks with a diameter less than 15 centimeters or 6 inches. Now that's just a rough rule of thumb, and always I would say err on the side of caution. You don't want to go higher, you'd rather stick to lower. So what these cuts allow you to do is get more control of the actual stem, and they get more complex because as the stem gets bigger, there's more tension and compression. So if we think of a stage 1 cut or a first level cut, this is a small diameter stem. It'll be easily controlled with 1 cut, and I can hold it with my hand. So we'll do a stage 1 cut which is straight through. I don't need to worry too much about the tension and compression because I can control it with my hand. So now there's quite a neat cut there already, but I've got enough left behind that if I want to clean it up or put a different angle on it, I can do that without worrying about the tensions that exist in the actual stem. So now I can clean that stump up quite easily. So you want to have the stumps with a slope to shed water, and in this case it's actually facing the sun as well, so it'll dry out nicely and won't be a source of infection. So for the 2-stage cut, what you do is you actually do is cut in from one side and then a second cut from the other side. So we start off on the side that's under compression, and in this case it's leaning slightly this way, so this will be under compression. It's also the way I want it to fall, and then this side's under tension. So you release some of the pressure on the compression side, and then we do the felling cut on the other side. Now the side that's under tension is likely to split, so it's another reason for cutting slightly higher up, but also for doing a 2-stage cut, is to try and reduce the potential for splitting, and it gives you a bit more control on the fell. So my first cut is there, my second cut's going to be on the opposite side and slightly higher. So there's the first cut, and that was the second one. Now you can actually see a bit of a split that started there. So the advantage of doing 2 stages, the split is going to stop at that point and not split all the way down the trunk. So it gives you a bit more control. So now I can clean up this section. There's no more tension in this piece of wood, and I can cut the stump to the height I want and keep it nice and clean. So I've just cleaned up the stump. It's sloping towards the sun to the south, so it'll shed water and dry out, and it's quite low to the ground, but so it'll allow good flushing in the spring. So for this tree I'm going to use the 3-stage cut. This has actually got 2 sort of main dominant stems and then a large one below, but rather than trying to fell that with the complexity of these 2, I'm going to take them down separately, and then I can clean up the stump afterwards. Now I've cleaned up some of the side branches here so it can be better access to the cut, and that's always a good idea. So with the 3-stage cut, you're going to create a mouth on the side you want it to fall, and then you're going to do a back cut slightly higher again, but on the back side, and that's what's going to allow it to fall. Now the back cut will be through the piece that's under tension, and the mouth's going to be, in this case, on the side that's under compression. It's not always going to be like that, but that's how it is now, and often the best way. Now, when you do the back cut, you leave a small little section, about 10% of the diameter, as a hinge, and that hinge gives you more control and allows it to be a safer fell. So this first cut is the diagonal down, and you're aiming to be 1/4 to 1/3 of the way through the diameter of the trunk, not much more than that. So that's your first cut. So the second cut now is parallel to the ground, and it's the bottom end of this mouth cut, and you're aiming to meet up with the two sides. So the neater this cut is, the more control you'll have. So you want him to meet up and be nice and neat, and this will be the mouth that will control the fall. So for the third cut, I'm going to be coming in from the back, but I want to be parallel to this here. I don't want to be at an angle, so I need to be aware of that angle when I come in from the back. Now, because of the second trunk, I can't be flat, so I'm going to come in on a downward cut, which is fine, and it's not too much of a problem, but it allows you to deal with this second trunk. So at this point now, I've got a piece of hinge wood, and I can push, so you can either use a lever bar or felling bar, or in this case it's small enough just to push, so I can push it over in the direction I want. Now importantly, particularly if you get bigger, you want to be to the side, not behind this tree and not in front of it. If it splits up, it could hit you in the face, so always be to the side. So now that the stump has been felled, there's no splits, and I can clean it up. Well, in this case, I'm actually going to go down to the final height on this big stump. So this section here is actually the hinge. Now I went a bit skew, you can see it's angled, which will give it a bit of a tilt when it fells. That ideally should be straight through. I was a bit caught up against this trunk, which limited my angle, but that hinge there is what gives you control when the trunk is coming down. So it's important to always leave that hinge. So for the second stem, I actually wanted to drop to my right. Now it's actually leaning towards me, so where it wants to fall is towards me. But by doing the 3-stage cut, you're able to control it and move it in the direction you want. So I'm going to do the mouth on this side and the back cut on this side, and it should allow me to keep it under control and drop it in the direction that I want. So I'll do the mouth cut number 1, number 2, and then number 3. So there's the mouth. I want the tree to fall this way. My back cut's going to come in from this side. I remember I want to leave about 10% of the wood as a hinge, and I want to try and be as parallel to that mouth cut as possible, coming slightly above that cut. Doesn't have to be too much, but a little bit above helps with the hinge. So now it's ready to fall. So I'm going to stay to the side, and I should be able to push this over under control in the direction I want. So that hinge has stopped it from flicking up to me. There's a bit of a split, but ultimately I'm going to be taking it off there, which is why it helped to cut it higher up, and then I can clean up the stump where I want it. But this is under control, and it's not going to hurt me. Now, I would suggest that anything larger than this, if you're new to felling, you should leave it to somebody who's a bit more experienced, or go and do a chainsaw course and get proper instruction, because there's a lot of weight even in a small trunk, and it can get quite dangerous if this hasn't been done properly and flicks up. it is quite a dangerous activity, so stay within your comfort zone and only really attempt trees that are of a small diameter. So here you can see the bottom of the mouth. That was the hinge, and this was the second cut. I could have come lower with this, but it stopped the trunk from flicking back. So the hinge controlled it as well as that lip. Okay, so I'm nearly through in this final cut, and although there's no tension really in the stump, I've got good control. You want to go really slowly at the end so you don't split out the bark. So that's my final cut. Stem sloping down, it's quite low to the ground, so it's ready for the new coppice growth. So now the next step is processing the Feld stem, and usually the first step in this would be snedding or limbing, which is taking all the side branches off. Now you can do that with secateurs, loppers, or the Bowsaw for larger ones, and they are certainly safer to use, but that is a bit slower. So often people will use something like a billhook or a light axe. So my preferred option is a small axe. It's a bit quicker. I like using them, but they do come with some inherent dangers. Now, it's important when you're using a bladed tool that it is kept sharp. Now that sounds counterintuitive, but a sharp blade is one that is more predictable. The blunter the blade is, the less predictable it is, and the more chance of an error or accident. So I'll just run through some very basic safety measures when you're using a hatchet for snedding. For anything more in depth, then I'll definitely point you towards Ben Scott's channel. He's got a very informative channel on using axes, a whole variety of axes, and he has got some very good safety information on that channel. I'll put it in the description below. First step is buy or make a cover for your hatchet. What you don't want to do is leave this lying on the floor when you accidentally kneel or kick it, and you could lose a toe. The second thing is, even though it's a small light hatchet, may seem fairly innocuous, the fact that it has a short handle means that it's actually going to be quite close to your body when you swing it. Now what you don't want to be doing is getting it anywhere near the front of your body. If you miss what you're aiming for and it goes into your legs and your femoral artery, it's extremely dangerous, and you don't want to be doing that. So the idea is, think of where the blade's going to end up and try and keep it to your side of your body so that it's glancing away. So the fundamental thing is, where will that end up if it goes wrong? You want it to end up going off to the side or behind you. So in this instance, I'm going to keep the stem between me and the axe. I'm going to be cutting on the off side. And the other thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be standing so that my final cut is behind me. So I'm going to be slicing towards behind me is what I'm aiming for. So if something goes wrong, the axe, if it glances off, it'll glance off that way. Or if it glances this way, it'll end up in the trunk. So a bill hook is very similar, although because it doesn't have such a long handle, it hasn't got as much leverage, but it does mean it's closer to your body. But it's the same principle. You want to be cutting away from yourself. So if you're nervous of bladed tools, I mean, they're much quicker for snedding, but you can always just stick to the Bowsaw. It is safer, and you will only use one tool then. So for those of you who asked for this information, hopefully that was of use. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.